The next speaker is Alexander Deeg from the University of Leipzig, so from my university. And he is talking about between prayer and protest. So the prayers for peace in the years of the GDR, the last days of the GDR, and the role of the Protestant churches in this peaceful revolution. So welcome.
So Chaim Tovim, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Angelika. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Eli, for the invitation and for organizing this important conference. I have to admit, since I studied in Israel in 1995, 1996, I'm quite closely related to this wonderful, great and complicated country. And I'm really worried these days and so happy that we have this conference here. 1995, 1996, this was the year when Rabin was assassinated, as you all know, and when Netanyahu became prime minister for the first time in May 1996. So somehow I wouldn't have thought that things might develop over such a period like this and deteriorate in this way. All the more, I'm happy to be here between prayer and protest in a good old German tradition. I brought you 3 points. I think that's very German to have 3 points in a lecture. After a short methodological introduction, I will talk about these prayers for peace in the German Democratic Republic and have a short summary afterwards. Prayers for peace in the late years of the German Democratic Republic as a paradigm of religious practices of non-violent resistance. Well, a historical paradigm, really. I know that it is highly problematic to say that some events of the past might be or serve as a paradigm for today. There is the historiographic problem. The situations are, of course, different. The situation in the late years of the German Democratic Republic is different than the situation today in Germany, than the situation here in these bad times in Israel, than any other situation. And there is not only the difference of historical situations, but there is also the problem of us as researchers, the hermeneutical or epistemological aspects. We are involved. We always have our interests, and thus we always pick out what we like and what we are most interested in and see as worthwhile for our discussion today. And concerning the history of the German Democratic Republic, I personally may tend to romanticize what I see there. At least it was a successful revolution. And for me as a theologian, it is of course interesting to see that the church had quite a positive effect and aspect there, and not the negative aspects which we have so often when we talk about church history, a history of failure, violence, abuse, and so on. Having said all this, on the other hand, it would of course be fatal not to try to learn from history, from the terrible developments and mistakes, and from the things that went pretty well. We have a responsibility in our time to describe as objectively as possible what happened then, and then try to find our learnings with all the epistemological and historiographical problems in mind. So, second point, prayers for peace in the GDR, a short history. Our town, Leipzig, always played a very special role in the German Democratic Republic, as some of you may know. It was an international fair city. It was connected with the West. There were many, many international guests, and Western media were all around. And in Leipzig, the prayers for peace had a very special and a long tradition. The prayers for peace started in one of the 2 central churches, inner city churches of Leipzig, in the church of St. Nikolai, which you see here, and on an image from the time of the German Democratic Republic here. And they started these prayers already in 1982. It was a deacon, Hans-Joachim Döring, who then decided that he wanted to give young people a chance to articulate their fears and sorrows. And an open prayer seemed a good space for him to do exactly this. It was time, he thought, for people to pray to God. And at the same time, he knew that this would be eminently political from the very beginning. Alone to mention the fears and sorrows of young people in the German Democratic Republic was political. As for the state doctrine, there were no fears and sorrows of young people. Why should there be any in a just perfect state, as they wanted to show their state as the better Germany? So Hans-Joachim Döring started to invite young people Monday, 5 p.m. to St. Nikolai Church. And maybe one learning, which is one of the most important things for me, is that he from the very beginning decided not only to meet once or twice, but to have a regular meeting, Monday, 5 p.m. So when Pastor Christoph Wonneberger came to Leipzig in 1986, he continued to coordinate these prayers Monday, 5 p.m. And every week, a different group of mainly young people organized the prayer and thus received a voice for their concerns. Groups for the protection of the environment, for peace, for civil rights, for conscientious objectors, and so on. And maybe really the one thing which was special in Leipzig is they were convinced they needed a regular time slot. Something like that, a regular time slot, just that you know this is the time for our prayer. And thus they provided a space. I think if you do things once, it's just an activity. If you do it twice, you slowly get a structure. If you do it for the third time, it may already be a ritual. And this is what these prayers of peace transformed to be very, very soon. It is not so that all of the church officials were in favor of these prayers. Some were very reluctant, were full of fear that this religious and political activity might lead to restrictions and to the loss of freedom for the churches in the GDR. But they continued and became an inspiration for prayers in many other of the big cities and all of the smaller cities of German Democratic Republic. And Monday, 5 p.m. became a symbolic date in the times in the late years of the German Democratic Republic. And then in 1989, in this crazy year in Germany, they were there. These prayers and this time slot and this space in this strange days of the end of the German Democratic Republic, when German Democratic Republic celebrated its 40th birthday and people realized how cracked the facade of the regime had already become. It was the time when Gorbachev said, you may remember this, life punishes those who come too late, and all who had ears to hear knew about whom he had said that. It was the time when more and more people left the GDR, fled from the GDR. It was the summer when Hungary opened the walls and fences. And in these times, Monday, 5 p.m. was just there. And the churches filled and filled with more and more people in Leipzig and in these other cities of the GDR. And something interesting happened. From the churches, the demonstrations also went outside of the churches. People came out, gathered around the churches, and so demonstrations in the streets starting with these prayers for peace. In September 1989, more and more people came to join the prayers, and the demonstrations outside grew at the very same time. And then it was October 1989. The GDR celebrated its 40th birthday, and in the churches, there was a big question. Should we continue now and invite for our prayer, or should we stop now because it had become too dangerous? There were too many protesters, and the regime might want to throw down the demonstrations by violent forces. The tanks were already around. And in these churches on October 9, a Monday, 1989, many people were discussing the question, should we close the doors of the church for the first time for 7 years now, or should we stay with the open doors? The pastor who then was in charge of the prayer on October 9 was our neighbor until some weeks ago, and I talked a lot with him about these hours of tension, where all the big questions of church history of the German Democratic Republic became to some kind of a point at these hours of October 9. In the end, they decided we will have our prayer Monday, 5 p.m. Very soon the church was full, filled with people. Many of those who sat in the church were actually informal cooperators of the state security. So a lot of people sat there as well, wanting to listen to what happened there. At 5 p.m., the prayer started in an overcrowded church. Outside, more and more and more people gathered. After the prayer, people came out with burning candles. I will say a word about these candles in a minute. And they chanted, "No violence, keine Gewalt." And this was very, very effective. Months after this event, here you see St. Nikolai's Church inside, and here you see the big demonstration which then happened on the Leipzig ring, 70,000 people all around the inner city ring. Some months after these events, Horst Sindermann, the president of the GDR parliament, said an interesting sentence. We expected anything and we're ready for anything, but not for candles and prayers. Maybe one of the strong sentences about non-violent resistance and its power. If violence had started out of the churches, hundreds and hundreds of policemen and soldiers would have been there to end these demonstrations. As people came out with candles and shouting "no violence," everything changed. I could say a lot more about the story, but now a short analysis in 5 points. What did these prayers actually do? First, I would say they provided a space of freedom in an authoritarian regime. It was not the plan to create public demonstrations out of these prayers for peace. It was something which happened without any further intentionality. The Leipzig prayers for peace were open from the very beginning, as I told you, for very, very different people, for people who worked for the protection of the environment, for people who worked for conscientious objectors, for civil rights movements, and so on. All of them could gather, found a space and a place there, and then fairly open conversation was possible there, fairly open as informal cooperators of the state security were always there, also in the churches. One very brief example, there was a group of young students in Mariannestraße 46, an occupied house, who used this open space and did their work in order to bring people out of the church on the streets as well, to empower people to have the courage to demonstrate in the streets of Leipzig. And what was very, very important for them, Mariannestraße 46, they were not Christians, but they used this open space of the church as a space of freedom for them. And what they wanted to have is not to have a small little group of a student elite, but really to bring people together on the streets under some motto, under which a lot of people could unite and say, okay, this is our motto. One of these mottos this group created was, "We stay here. Wir bleiben hier. We won't leave the German Democratic Republic. We won't flee, but we stay here and want to change what we have here." Second, providing a space for truth. The structure of the prayers for peace Monday 5 p.m. was very, very simple, but one element was never missing. There was a time for information, for telling people what happened. In an environment of state-controlled disinformation, the prayers for peace became a space for telling the truth, which may be one of the most threatening aspects for an authoritarian regime. People who tell the truth. We may have an iconic picture of what this may look like when Russian journalist Marina Ovsyannikova showed a poster during the live broadcast of the main news on Russian television on March 14, 2022. You surely saw this. And we have many others of these pictures. Oscar Romero, for example, the Archbishop of San Salvador, who dedicated half of the time of his sermons just for telling the people what happened in the congregation in the last week. And this was maybe the most threatening thing for the regime in San Salvador. In this way, the prayers for peace were dangerous for the GDR regime, as they were spaces of truth in a world of lies. Third, the prayers for peace created something like a ritual community of believers and non-believers. Already in the 1980s, the motto of St. Nikolai's Church was St. Nikolai's Church, open for all. And this is still the logo. When you come to Leipzig, you still see it today. They did not want to be a place for Christians only, but for all. No one was asked if he or she was baptized who wanted to enter the church and to be there. All could come, a community of believers and non-believers. And somehow they succeeded in creating some kind of a new social identity of different people who gathered there to pray there. And also this was problematic in the time of an authoritarian regime, problematic for the regime, a new social identity of the protesters who were united in this church. 4, I already quoted Horst Sindermann. We expected anything, we're ready for anything, but not for candles and prayers. These prayers included very simple ritual practices. One of them, the lighting of candles. But they proved to be very effective. Try to walk with a candle in your hand, and you won't have any chance to be violent in any aspect, because you have to protect your candle outside against the wind, against the rain, and so on. So it's really a very, very symbolic gesture to say, okay, we walk with a candle in our hand. And at the same time, we know in trauma studies and ritual theories that one of the most traumatizing factors is for people to lose agency. People become victims and can't do anything. Ritual practices, as insignificant as they may seem, are much more. They work against this feeling of powerlessness. They help to regain agency and self-confidence. It is not that we can't do anything. Yes, we can. We can do something. Go to church, light a candle, walk on the city ring. My last point, here you see some people with the candles in their hands during these demonstrations and prayers. My last point, and here I would love to discuss a lot more with you, cultural anthropologists can tell us a lot about the power and the function of rituals. Especially Fritz Stahl, Carolyn Humphrey, and James Laidlaw talk a lot about the meaninglessness of ritual. Ritual is, in their view, an interruption of the usual way we lead our life, which is leading our life in the context of intentionality. Usually we do things in order to. And they say in a ritual, you lose this in order to. And so you interrupt the primary logic of what you usually do in your life. And this gives freedom. Somehow the Leipzig prayers for peace may have been so effective, paradoxically, because they were not intentionally planned to serve any aim or purpose other than providing space. They were not invented and designed in order to, but first and foremost, they were there and offered the space and the dimensions I already talked about. It may be exactly this meaninglessness which made them so functional and effective and meaningful. I sometimes imagine what had happened if pastors had planned exactly this. I think nothing would have happened, and it would have been a disastrous way of not having any effect at all. May this be a lesson to be learned. I come to my conclusion. Are there lessons to be learned? Maybe you already have some of your learnings. Maybe you have already decided there's not so much to learn from this history of the GDR in a time where our challenges are different, where you here and we in Germany are not fighting against an authoritarian regime, but are fighting against those who want to destroy democracy and transform democracies into authoritarian regimes. Maybe two interesting things what happened with these prayers. One interesting thing is they still exist today. Monday, 5 p.m. is still the time when you can go to Leipzig, go and be there in this prayer for peace. Sometimes they are very, very small, and sometimes kindergartens or other organizations are responsible for these prayers. But again, the time slot is there. And what we saw, Angelika, I think you were there as well, that immediately after February 24, 2022, the Russian attack on Ukraine, the space which was provided then filled again, and Nikolai's church was full again, and outside there were hundreds of people, so the symbolic time still works, yes, but the symbolic time also works in the other direction. Other people use this time now, and there are right-wing demonstrations every Monday at 5 p.m. So the symbolic date and time is also used by those who now claim that they want to have their freedom and their freedom of speech. Anti-democracy movements, right-wing demonstrations are there, walk over the ring. Of course, they do not enter the church, but they use the time for their demonstrations. I want to summarize in 4 very, very short theses. 1, the prayers for peace in Leipzig were successful because they united different people. They were never extreme in what was said there. The church maybe proved to be something like a moderator, giving a framework against any kind of extremism. A ritual community of different people, of believers and non-believers, was created, maybe an interesting aspect for other non-violent resistance movements. Second, the prayers for peace provided a space of freedom in which different ideas could develop. Monday, 5 p.m. was just there, and there was this old church building in a very simple liturgical form. That's it, nothing more. No event was created, but space was offered. 3, the prayers for peace functioned as a very simple ritual, giving people back some agency and empowering people. I think peaceful nonviolent resistance is connected with social identity by joint practices. This is what is needed and what you may find here as well. And 4, there was an intersection of religious and political practice. Of course, I think any religious practice is political, but here we see religious practices which are political in a stricter sense. The prayers for peace in Leipzig were practices which explicitly interrupted the state doctrine, explicitly questioned the authority of the regime, offered space for voices which were silent officially, and offered practices, speaking the truth, naming the powers, lighting candles, which situate these prayers between prayer and protest. And at least in these senses, I would dare to say that these practices can serve as a paradigm for non-violent resistance. Toda Rabba, thank you so much.